Now, when we talk about the fourth phase in the history of Muslims, this coincided with the domestication of Islam. The first American we know in history who took an active part and about whom we know a lot was Alexander Russell Webb. He was the first white American to embrace Islam, and he represented Muslims at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in 1893. He was a journalist, he was a member of the Theosophical Society, and he was the U.S. Consul General in Manila, Philippines in the 1890s. But he became a Muslim in the 1890s, over 100 years ago, and he had contact with some of the rich Muslims in India, British India, and came to New York, Manhattan, and established an office there and a publishing house. And he published the first major Muslim publication called The Muslim World in the United States. Now, Webb would set the stage.
Would you write his name on?
Yes. Oh boy. Yeah, Muhammad, I think I can put it here. Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb. You will come across this fellow in the literature. I mean, and Webb tried his very best to plant Islam in America. He published the first major publication, the mother of all magazines and journals produced in America, was started by him. And he wrote a book called Islam in America. And that book, which was published in 1893, was the first book ever published by a Muslim in this country, talking about Islam in America at that time. Now, Webb, of course, went to India, British India, and gave lectures. There are people now who are pulling his lectures together to publish them for the benefit of scholars and people who are interested. Now, Webb planted the seed of Islam in American society in New York. And then, of course, many Islamized groups or heretical, non-Islamic groups gradually took root within the African American community. You had a fellow by the name of Timothy Drew from North Carolina who had immigrated to New Jersey area, who was somehow exposed to some of these Masonic literature, some knowledge of Islam, but not correct Islam, who established the Moorish Science Temple, which is a heretical group that appeared within American society, particularly in the East Coast. And there are still remnants of the Moorish Science Temple. One characteristic of the Moorish Science Temple is that those people who are identified with their movement change their last names to Bey, B-E-Y. There's a Turkish title that was used in the Arab world, especially in Morocco and Egypt. I mean, the Turks, just like the British will knight you and they call you Sir Pasivin Harris. You see, the Turks also have a title. They give you a title of Pasha, P-A-S-H-A, Pasha, or they call you Bey, Sulayman Bey, or Sulayman Pasha. You see, so these Turkish titles. Now, this noble Drew Ali, who was an African American from North Carolina and was somehow exposed to some of these cultural practices from the Muslim world, established the Moorish Science Temple. And that changed the whole dress code of his followers. They dress in white, they put on the fez, the men, and the women cover their heads. And then, of course, this movement would inspire another movement that will appear among the African Americans and would receive greater attention in American society than any other within the African American community, and that is the Nation of Islam, which was founded by an elusive figure about whom there is still debate among scholars as to who he really was. His name was Farad Muhammad, but he has many other aliases, Wali Farad, and all kinds of names he had. Now, this fellow would be the mentor of Elijah Muhammad, and of course Elijah Muhammad would dominate the Nation of Islam from the early 30s until his death in February 1975. And of course, out of that movement, you have a number of personalities who who would have influence in American society. The most famous ones are Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and Louis Farrakhan. These are the most widely known to Americans who don't have any clue as to Islam, but they hear these names in the American media. And likely these were people who were influenced by the Nation of Islam philosophy. The Nation of Islam philosophy, of course, goes against traditional Orthodox Islamic teaching. Now we can leave the theology aside, and if you have questions later on, we'll come to that. What I want to tell you is that when we talk about the fourth phase of Islamic development in the United States, we see how Webb introduced what I consider the Webbian understanding of Islam, which was based on Orthodox Islamic teachings. But there is a heterodox understanding of Islam, which I will call the Elagihian tendency. So you have in the history of Islam the Webbian as opposed to the Elagihian. And of course, these two tendencies still exist within the Muslim community, and it cuts across immigrants and native-born Americans. Now, besides Webb, there was, and Farad Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad, there was an African American who was exposed to Orthodox Islam. Now, his relationship with Webb is problematic. None of the scholars who research this fellow, and of course he is one of the least written about fellow, but we know about him, and I had the opportunity of interviewing his wife before she died. And what is colorful about this couple is that Sheikh Dawood Faisal, who grew up in Brooklyn, and his mosque is known as the Straight Street Mosque in Brooklyn, New York, was the son, according to his alleged background, of a Moroccan, and his mother was a West Indian. Now his wife was the daughter, Sister Khadija, as she was known when she was alive, and I got the chance to interview her in 1980. I mean, she claimed to be the daughter of a Pakistani immigrant and a West Indian mother. Now, what makes them very interesting in terms of the history of Islam in the United States is that this couple were musicians. This is the connection between Islam and music in America. And if you read Dizzy Gillespie, I'm sure you know Dizzy Gillespie, if you read his autobiography, To Be or Not to Bop, because they were he belongs to that generation of American musicians known as the beboppers. Now, of course, the Generation X people, some of them, not all of them, are identified with hip-hop. So, I mean, their generation is known as the beboppers. So when he wrote his autobiography, he called the autobiography To Be or Not to Bop. So, now if you read that book, you will see in his autobiography, Dizzy Gillespie is saying that Islam attracted some of these African-American musicians for one reason. And of course, you have some of these musicians who were Muslims. Some of them became Baha'is. People like Coltrane. You see, now what is very interesting is that there is that connection between Islam and some of these musicians. And you find that some of these rappers now, even those who are not Muslims, you see, some of them take Muslim names, like Latifa. You see, Latifa will dangle a cross around her neck, but she's not a Muslim. She's a Christian, but she changed her name to Latifa. And when they sing, they will say Allah, Allah, and all kinds. You see this on MTV. So what is very interesting is that there is that connection that developed during this fourth phase in terms of Islam and music within the African American community. And of course, the Dawood family, Sheikh Dawood, who started out as a musician with his wife Khadija, but then they discovered Islam and they became actively involved. This couple would be the mothers and father of most of the Sunni Muslims among African Americans. Not a single Sunni African American Muslim group that came after them could not be linked intellectually and genealogically to the State Street Masjid, because when they were younger, they used to go there. There was no other place for them to go. And they became linked to Sheikh Dawood Faisal, and afterwards many of them broke away. The Islamic Brotherhood, Inc. of Brother Tawfiq in New York was part of Sheikh Dawood Faisal. The Dar al Islam movement, which became a major movement among African Americans following Sunni Islam, was influenced by Sheikh Dawood Faisal. The Islamic Party of North America, which was headed by Musafruddin, was also influenced by Sheikh Dawood. Now, what is very interesting is that Sheikh Dawood, in his lifetime, tried to educate African Americans on Sunni Islam and was vigorously opposed to Elijah Muhammad. And then some of these African Americans who didn't go through the Nation of Islam were exposed to Sunni Islam by the students who were coming to America.